Now that we understand how to adjust the dynamic properties and maybe play with some of the clumping, curling, and other modifiers we can apply to the hair, now it's time to take a look at shading. I've created another version of the hair system here that has more follicles, more clumps, and I've also increased the number of hairs per clump so that we have enough thick hair that will render well. Additionally, I've created a simple lighting setup. If we dolly back here, in our main view, you can see I've created just a simple triangle light setup, and I've got shadows cast from this single point light. I want to select that point light and go to the attributes, Control A, just to show you that I've enabled depth map shadows and that I've increased the bias to a value of 0.01. If we're rendering with Maya software, then you have to use depth map shadows for the hair. You can't use ray tracing. If you're rendering with Mental Ray, then you do want to use ray tracing. Additionally, there's a bit of a quirk with the Maya software renderer and depth map shadows. I needed to increase the bias a little bit to prevent shadows from appearing where they weren't supposed to. Bias is the distance from the shadow to the receiving surface. So in any event, I've increased the bias a little bit to a value of 0.01. All right, so let's get in close and let's play the simulation, let the hair settle down. And because I have more hairs here, of course, it's running more slowly. Once it's settled down on frame 7 or 8, I'll press the stop button. And let's do a test render and see what this looks like with no adjustments to the hair shape node. Click render the current frame. Okay, that's our hair with default shading settings. And I've got shadows turned on, by the way, because if they were not, then the hair would be really overlit. Okay, so we're going to store that image. And then we want to select the hair. We can do that a couple ways, maybe just select it in the viewport. With that hair selected, go to the attribute editor and the hair system shape node. Scroll down and we want to find the shading section. So here's shading. We've got several main attributes here. We've got the color of the hair, and that's its diffuse color or main base color. We've got the hair color scale, which controls the brightness along the length of each hair. Translucence is backlighting. And then we've got specular color, which is the color of the shiny highlight, and specular power, which is the focus of the shiny highlights. Hair color is the diffuse color. We'll look at that first. You'll notice that the rendering is much brighter than this color swatch here. And that's just because what Maya does is it adds each one of these components together. So the diffuse color is then added to the translucence, which is then added to the specular. And what you end up with is, even though your base color is really dark, the rendering ends up being quite bright. So this base color or diffuse color needs to always be really quite dark. I can make this more of a ginger color. Click on that swatch and maybe bring the hue down to more of a red. And maybe increase the value and saturation just a little bit. And go ahead and see what that looks like. Do another test render. That's the result we get from just adjusting the diffuse color alone. We can go ahead and store that image, and then we can scroll through the different versions here. You can see there's the blonde version, there's the ginger version. Now I want to look at hair color scale. It's much easier to see the effect of hair color scale if there's no translucence and no specular color. I'll set the translucence down to 0 and bring the specular color down to black. And that way we can just isolate the effect of hair color scale. It's the brightness of the hairs along their length, with the root at the left and the tip at the right. If I select this color swatch here and reduce its brightness, we'll be able to see the effect of the hair color scale. So with that set down nearly to black, I'll do another test render. And as you can see, the roots are now black and the tips are now colored according to this hair color. And additionally, you'll notice because we have no translucence and no specular, this color corresponds very closely to the color that we see at the tips of the hairs. Good. Now we wouldn't ever want this to be actually black. We would want it to be a medium gray, maybe 50% or something like that. And that means we would just get a kind of dark shading effect near the roots of the hairs. Translucence is backlighting. We need some amount of translucence because hair is so thin in the real world that light really shines right through it. Translucence value probably should be somewhere around 0.2 or 0.3. Go ahead and render that. Now we've got some translucence and you can see that it's just made everything brighter overall. I'll store that image. And then finally, we've got specular color and specular power. Specular color is the color of the shiny highlights. And for hair, we usually want that color to be similar to the diffuse color. I'll click in that slot and maybe choose one of these existing swatches that we've made already. And you'll see now, basically I've got the hair color and the specular color set to the same. And we'll test that, see what it looks like. We'll store this one first. What we see here now is that because of the additive nature of this shader, with the specular color set to the same as the hair color, we're getting very strong, bright highlights here. We might want to modulate that. You might want to select that and maybe bring the saturation down a bit and bring the brightness up a little bit, which will send it more towards white. And test that, see what it looks like. Okay, now we've got kind of a coppery look here. Finally, you've got the specular power, and that's the intensity of the highlights. With a low specular power, such as the default of 3, then you'll get highlights that kind of spread evenly across the hair. If you want the highlights to be more intensely focused, giving a more streaked effect, then you can increase the specular power. Turn that up maybe almost all the way. Value of 15, we'll try that and do a test render. Okay, so you can see with the specular power increased up to a value of about 15 or so, now we've got more focused highlights. And I kind of like that look better. One last thing to look at here is color randomization. I can open that up. And you can see we have the ability to randomize these different shader properties. And you'll notice that diffuse rand and specular rand already have some value in them. And you can increase this and make it more extreme if you want, so that different hairs will be brighter or darker depending upon the intensity of this value. You can also maybe play around with saturation and value randomness here, but I would leave the hue randomness alone because you can't really control the color palette and it doesn't tend to work terribly well. You'll get unnatural colors if you use that hue rand. So I'll store that one and then do another rendering so we can see the difference between the randomized colors and the more uniform colors. Okay, so that's pretty clear now that we've got random colors. You can see the difference here. So that's no randomization or very little randomization, and that's with quite a lot of randomization. All right, so that is the basics of using the shader properties inherent in the hair system shape node.